We are back with the Training Model Podcast. Thank you very much for sticking by. I know in the very last episode, I was like, this is going to become a weekly thing, and then my whole world kind of just got flipped on its head, and I've had an incredibly stressful few weeks. However, I am now back, and I've set this as a priority. I want to keep this thing rolling and hitting it, and keeping everybody up to date with some of the stuff that's going on and just some of the discussions that I'm having, because the discussions are becoming more detailed, which is awesome. Um, the reach of the content is definitely helping, and the sort of outcomes as a result of the movement mentorship currently, and then as the wormhole starts to build out, those things are really starting to have an impact, which is awesome, which is something that I've wanted to sort of lean back in towards with the coach education stuff and all the stuff here at Training Model. And it's just been really fulfilling. Stressful few months getting this thing rolling whilst making some pretty significant changes at strength culture as well, which behind the scenes, those processes are really starting to move forward now, and hopefully start to feel the benefits of those things. Like most things, though, they take longer than my brain sometimes wants them to take, and I can get a bit disheartened. But the processes are in place, the inputs are in place. So if we've got the strategy right, we should start to see some improvements there on a couple of things that I've been a bit frustrated with. But overall, really positive on a lot of fronts, a lot of changes, but we are moving. So today I wanted to chat about a discussion that we had in intake 2 of the mentorship. It actually wasn't in intake 2, it was in a DM with one of the students or one of the coaches. I don't like calling them students, just one of the coaches that are in there, related to the rib cage and like relative motion of the rib cage and orientational repositioning of the rib cage, and what those two things are, and how they actually play out when we discuss movement of the upper extremity or movement of the system within the context of the rib cage. So when we discuss relative motion, the way that I like to think about this is relative is contextual. We can have relative motion relative to the ground is one common place that people in the industry talk about, and that is pushing force down into the ground. So when we push force down into the ground, generally we are lifting mass up. So any of that motion can be relative to the ground, and typically this can get labeled in this idea of compression into the ground or a compressive force down into the ground. Generally, it gets linked with internal rotation, things like dorsiflexion, plantar flexion, dorsiflexion, internal rotation, pronation of the foot. All of those sort of things can be analogous of these ideas, mainly through Bill Hartman's model and the influence that he's had. But ultimately, we're just talking about pushing down into the ground. So you could have relative motions with that. You could also have relative motions to midline, which is another classic one that people talk about. And these are the ideas of like moving in through adduction and internal rotation towards midline, and out through abduction and external rotation. And generally, the coupled actions get moved in as a relative movement towards or away from midline. There's also this idea of relative motion at specific joints. And when we think in the context of specific joints, what we're talking about is relative motion of the bones moving on or around each other. And when we think about the rib cage, the most common idea of rib cage relative motion is the actual ribs themselves moving on the spine. So they obviously insert into the vertebra through the thoracic spine, and some demifacets and some technical stuff related to the anatomy of that. But for the most part, 12 thoracic vertebrae, 12 ribs, they insert into the thoracic spine. And when a rib cage moves relative, or when a rib cage moves through relative motion, we should be seeing rotation happening of those joints. And that is that the ribs themselves are rotating. And it's not this huge orientational shift of the rib cage just moving in space as a block, is the term that I like to use. It's just a block of movement. So to turn left, there's two options. We can relatively compress and expand the rib cage left and right in order to turn into that left position. So that would be compressing the right side and pushing the rib cage open on the left side. So closing one and opening one, the other side, that would be relative motion. Or we can actually just orient the rib cage and turn the whole system and turn the whole thing as a block towards the left. And when we think about performance-based outcomes outside of the gym in athletic endeavors, quite often what we will see is a combination of both. There will be a little bit of relative loading, and then all of a sudden the whole thing will shift as huge amounts of force move through the system and we express performance. However, in the gym, those huge like block movements of the rib cage can actually be detrimental to a lot of people's lifting goals. And the reason is because all of a sudden the load gets moved directly to whatever has actually moved the rib cage in space. Quite often with lifting and strength training, it's the low back. The low back has obviously extended and turned to the left, and that's what's taken the rib cage around. And then all of a sudden we start to get a bunch of like tension response of the muscles, and you can feel tight and all of this sort of stuff. If we compare that to actually turning the rib cage to the left and actually compressing one side and opening the other side, all of that movement means that all of the muscles that were coordinated to create that motion have shared and distributed the load across the entire system. And then all of a sudden we end up with better improvements of feelings, improvements in rotation, improvements of stiffness, and improvements of overall just capacity for lifting and tolerance of load, because it's shared across more structures because of that relative loading and that relative positional changes of the rib cage. And we were having this discussion within the DMs around particularly like a junior athlete who was feeling a lot of low back tension. And it actually got to the point where I think they actually broke a lumbar vertebra. And I remember back when I was learning a lot of this stuff with Cressy, back when I did the Cressy internship, that was a very typical presentation for maybe not a broken vertebra in the lumbar spine, but a lot of these like low back spine problems for these high level junior athletes. And Cressy used to speak a lot about like these overhead positions and this pitching position of getting the arm overhead, and how we can load into that and ultimately like stretching into that position. Not so much stretching, but by going through relative motion of the shoulder blade moving on the rib cage and the rib cage moving and orienting and loading into that position and actually sharing and distributing the load, it means that all of that rotation and that demand for load tolerance is shared along all of the structures of the system. Comparing that to something like somebody who just twists and dumps forward with an extension of the lower back, that is where all the load's going to get taken to, and the arm just ends up where it ends up. And there was a lot of discussions around these high-level junior guys who are overhead athletes and moving in position and controlling their lumbar spine, Cressy uses the term anterior core, building anterior core stiffness and developing that position and that awareness in training in order to improve the loading of the upper body through that rotation in loading the arm. And it's something that has just always, no matter how deep into these ideas of movement, it just continually comes back to how true that statement is that a lot of the times, and I don't want to use the term like core stability because I just hate that term, but a lot of the times just teaching people to improve their awareness of where their rib cage and where their pelvis are in space helps so many expressions of performance, whether you're strength training, whether you're dealing with rehabilitation, whether you're dealing with performance, whether you're dealing with hypertrophy and understanding the trunk position and lengthening and shortening different muscles, lats and pecs and adductors and hamstrings and glutes and abs and all of that sort of stuff. Like, so much of it stems, and so much of our positional demand stems from where the center of the human is. And this is why I like the center of mass idea and the position of the center of mass, because it has such a huge impact on everything that moves outside of that. But also, as everything's moving from outside towards the mass and towards midline, there's so much implication in that as well. And I think one of the easiest places to start teaching people to improve these positions and improve that loading is simply just getting a better awareness of where their pelvis and where their rib cage are in space. And part of that is this orientational understanding of the rib cage and just bringing it back closing off the front, maybe shifting it back if you wanted to shift a center of mass back, shifting it back, closing the front side, and feeling ab tension, hopefully oblique tension to pull the ribs down. But I think that is just one of the easiest places to start with improving movement competency in the gym for all outcomes. And it's something that is strong within my model. And it starts with just understanding the relative positions of the system. So where the rib cage is in space relative to the ground or relative to the pelvis, but then also as we get deeper into it is moving the rib cage itself and actually creating relative motion within the rib cage and getting this expansion and compression to return to the rib cage so the system can start to actually distribute loads better when it accesses these deeper positions of ERs and away from midlines and all of this sort of stuff. The more rotation that's required through the system, if we can start to consume some of that with the proximal structures, generally we're going to have a better time in the gym. So we chatted through all of that sort of stuff and just getting some competency of just like learning pelvic position, sagittal, posterior and anterior tilt, learning rib cage position, sagittal, forward and posterior shifting of rib cage, and better contextualizing the tension response of the muscles when we move in those ways. Hopefully we're starting to get obliques in that shifting back because the obliques have an added benefit of not just core tension, but also the idea that it can close the false ribs and actually start to get the rib cage to regain some of that motion, that relative motion that we're looking for within the ribs themselves. And that's a huge part of something that we're probably going to be starting to chat about tomorrow with the rib cage in the mentorship. But it really does start with just awareness of where the rib cage is in space and moving it back or moving it forward or rotating it left and right as a unit. But once we've got that understanding, a lot of the benefits then come from regaining the relative motion of the ribs themselves. And this is where breathing drills begin to fit into the discussion, because as much as I hate the narratives that are surrounded by breathing drills, and a lot of it stems from the PRI stuff and their ideas around these asymmetries, which are definitely true, but these asymmetrical patterns that everyone's loaded into the right hip with a rib cage that's turned left to open that up, and all of these sort of things, or to counteract that rotation, all of these sort of narratives. I think the crux of what PRI can teach us is that when we position the skeleton in a very particular position, and we demand a complete exhale in that position and remove the internal pressure as a response of exhaling and getting the air out, and demanding more of the superficial muscles and the muscular tension response to hold our shape, because it's no longer being held by an inhaled. If you think about like a basketball, if the basketball is inhaled, it holds its shape a lot easier. But if you were to take all the air out, all of a sudden that basketball and the leather can start to move a lot easier, and we can actually like start to position it and change the tension response. The human skeleton and the muscular system is no different. If we've got a bunch of air on the inside, it becomes very difficult for us to actually create that motion, that relative motion of the rib cage. Sometimes we actually need to get all of the air out and position ourselves in a position that turns the rib cage into the direction that we want. And that turning of the rib cage and the ribs through their IRs and ERs and their compressions actually starts to change the tension response of all of these muscles and actually increase the relative motion of the rib cage itself. And this is what PRI, I think, the crux, the objective stuff that PRI teaches without the narratives, is simply just that, is that when we use exhales properly and demand more from the muscular system, we can actually begin to move the rib cage relative to itself and relative to the spine and relative to being the left and the right side, and open one side and close one side and actually regain that relative motion. And it's a huge understanding. And once you've got it, you can kind of be like a magician in helping people reposition themselves and change tension response of the neck and the scapthoracic muscles and even down into the lumbar spine and into the pelvis and into the hip in simply just understanding how to regain that relative motion of the rib cage and learn to compress one side and expand to the other side. So it's been a huge little chat that we've been going through, and I'm keen to keep rolling through with the mentorship. But I just wanted to chat about it here because I think uh, it's a huge thing to kind of grasp. And I think the most important thing is not learning it with the narratives. By all means, if you want to go and learn PRI, the best place to learn it is through PRI, and dive in the rabbit hole and get as much as you can out of it. Just don't drink all the Kool-Aid and all the narratives and take all of these like assumed outcomes as a response to simply just that the system is asymmetrical. That's okay. Everyone's is, and it's fine. We live in an asymmetrical world. We have asymmetrical hobbies and strategies of movement everywhere. There's no doubt that the system itself is asymmetrical from a structural position, but also just an expression of the functional stuff that we do in life as well. That's fine. It helps you shred that narrative with clients. But if you're going to go learn PRI, I would highly recommend it. It was massive for me in my understanding, but try not to drink all the Kool-Aid and all the narrative. So just something that I wanted to chat about because it's been a key topic that I've been thinking about, at least when I've been helping this coach in the mentorship, but also as we start to move deeper into the intake 2, which has been awesome. I wasn't expecting the response that I got. I ended up with 64 coaches in there, which is wild. We're at 105 within 2 intakes, which has blown my expectation of how this thing was going to roll. I'm super keen to keep it going and continue to refine it and modify some of the lessons and some of the sessions, especially the content calls for intake 3, which will be coming up and opening, in a couple of months, but it'll be at the start of next year. I've toyed with running one more this year because I've had a bunch of people tell me that they're keen on the next one, but I think I'm just going to let it roll and continue to develop some of the other stuff that's important for my business at Training Model, but also at Strength Culture. So I think it is going to be towards the end of January, but it will launch in November, the start of November, along with the opening of the wormhole. So I'm keen to keep rolling with that and keep building out this sort of like community of coaches that are starting to learn from me and my model and my understanding, which has been actually really fulfilling, especially the feedback that I got from intake 1, which was awesome, and already some of the feedback that I'm getting from intake 2, which is great. Not expected this early, but it's awesome. Just really just elevating, I think, the general understanding of some of these detailed, complex ideas around movement, programming, and coaching to hopefully make it more simple. That's the goal, is confidence in application for those that are in there. And I think I'm moving in that direction, which is awesome. I really love it when we start to dive deep into something that's very specific and very complex. But then if I've done a good job, especially with the pre-learning modules and intake and the first 2 calls, if I've done a really good job with those things, we can bring it back to some common ground and then build the idea from there forward and take everyone along for the ride with it, which we're definitely starting to do, which is awesome. So thank you to everyone that's jumped in. Thank you for everybody that's been engaging with the content. And now as I start to get back into this formal content, being the podcast here, and then also the YouTube channel, which is a priority for myself to wrap the year up really strong. I just feel like it's just going to continue to go and continue to grow. So I'm really happy for the direction of all that sort of stuff, and it's just been great. So thank you for sticking by me. Thank you for checking things out. And if you've been part of the intake 1 or 2, thank you very much for trusting me with your education and your understanding. It's not an easy thing to do, especially if you've been burnt by other mentors and all of that sort of stuff in the past. Take it from me, I've spent so much money on continued education outside of the formal structure of university. Been to America twice to learn, internship at Cressy, spent some time at iFast, came home, started Strength Culture, did continued education with like Mike Teixeira, of Reactive Training Systems and all of their classrooms from a few years back. Online courses with Gary Ward, even more detailed things, going back over to America, Zach Couples' Human Matrix, Pat Davidson's Rethinking the Big Pattern. I was fortunate enough to come across very good mentors that spent a lot of time with me and really helped me understand. But I understand that there's also a lot of mentors out there and people that are in a similar position to me that that charge a shit ton and don't actually offer that much. And it's just not who I want to be. Part of that reason is why the first two intakes of the internship or the mentorship have been lower price points, is because I want to build that trust, and I want to build that proof that I actually mean this, that I want to help coaches understand it, because I was the confused coach, and it took me 5, 6, 7 years of really deep diving into this stuff to get to an understanding where I'm now incredibly confident in the way I help people and my gym here at Strength Culture and the clients and people that come to the gym and the online and all of that sort of stuff. So I want people to feel that same confidence that I have and help accelerate them. So super keen for the next sort of phase, which really will just wrap up the end of 2024 for me and the development of training model. And again, just thank you for all that. Like, I really do appreciate it. A couple of other things to note. Because this podcast is also just like a little bit of a recap of what's going on and some of the fun shit that's happening. You would have seen this week that I've launched 2 training programs. So this is something that I've actually been thinking about for about 4 or 5 years now. I've actually got a file discussing what I was going to call core performance as just an overarching idea of application for lifting for lifters. This was like 4 years ago. I started it at the start of COVID, and then it just never happened. So I wanted to use core performance because it was an idea that I had like 4 or 5 years ago. But ultimately now, like, it's with everything else that's going on, it just made sense to be like 2 downloadable programs, one for squatting and deadlifting and the lower body, and then one for the upper body being bench press and reaching. So reaching patterns is a huge part of my model and my application of understanding center of mass and repositioning it and starting to actually train the upper extremity through some different patterns that aren't just this back and down, shoulder forward, chest position, and learning to get the scaps moving around the rib cage and actually loading them productively. So the bench press and reach program goes through all of that. But the goal for this is, and I kind of didn't think that the programs, and this might just be me being naive and what people actually want to learn from me. I never really thought that people would buy the programs and run the programs. Like, it's not like a 5-3-1 programming method or like a Candido type of powerlifting program or anything like that. It's kind of just like my flavor of programming, with a bunch of educations around it. And hopefully my end goal would be that you pick out some of the key things, and we'll get through some of those things, but you pick out some of the key things and just start to apply it to your own lifting and your own coaching and stuff like that. But obviously there are 2 and 3 day options for the lower body and the upper body. And if you purchase both of them in the bundle, you can pair the 2 lowers and the 2 uppers in whatever frequency you want to hit them with for a 4 or a 5 day option. You could go to a 6 day, but I probably wouldn't recommend the 6 day. I'd do a combo of a 2 and a 3 if you wanted to do that. So there are the programs in there, but alongside that, for each of the programs is around about 1.5 to 2 hours of actual just education around what I'm thinking about and the principles that I have in my head for programming. So programming principles and the application of those programming principles, and then also for movement. And the 2 movement principles are the center of mass, because that's the core thing that I want people to understand, is that everything is a reaction to whether the mass is being held and how gravity is being managed first and foremost. And that's all related to center of mass. So that is one of the key, if not the key principle in my movement sort of model. And the center of mass has I think it's like a 20-minute video for lower and a 20-minute video for upper body. And then how those ideas are bled into the programming and some of the sensory stuff that I'm talking about, and developing context and awareness around different positions relative to the center of mass. And then the second part is all related to the actual sensory motor continuum, which is an idea that I learned from Pat Davidson within his Rethinking the Big Patterns. And I think it's just the best sort of overarching idea related to how movement competency actually works. And it probably has to start with some sensory stuff, feeling things and building awareness and context, and then progressively moving through towards your output end, which is your motor output, which is the traditional training that everyone thinks about: strength, power, speed, endurance, and all of that sort of stuff. And this idea that we can sort of like slide people up and down the continuum as needed to improve their positions and improve their awareness and their understanding. So again, the center of mass and the sensory motor continuum are the two major principles of my movement model, and they're the two major principles that are within these programs and the discussion of how I'm thinking about them within the coaching themselves. The other really important thing is like the programming and the application of the ideas into programming. And then all of a sudden we get like some programming principles that are really important to understand around what I like to think of as training exposures, and the idea that if strength is the primary thing you're pushing for, which is the most important thing that I think within the gym itself, if you're pushing for strength outcomes, what does that actually mean? And how does that actually fit into programming, and how we can modify depending on the goals and the specific context of the clients and yourself in the gym, and ultimately starting to piece those ideas of skill development, of strength, a true strength exposure, and the strength stimulus of high loads, high RPEs, and good solid technique, and then also like a volume or a hypertrophy stimulus. And that's where I get to my 3 programming exposures and how to bleed those into the programs. And obviously I go through a step-by-step process of how I've built the programs using all of those principles. But then also I talk you through how to actually write your own programs within these ideas, and how to piece sensory stuff together. And there's like 45 exercise tutorials that are, some of them are pretty deep, other ones are just very little quick tidbits of different feelings and ideas that you're trying to piece together. And hopefully if you do decide to purchase the bundle, you can see the entire sort of like excursion of the things I'm thinking about, how I'm writing programs, and then how I'm looking at it in the gym with lifting. So I think it's a fucking awesome resource. They're $99 each. Or you can buy the bundle for $149. There is a code, which is CORE, CORE, for 30% off that will run through till midnight on this Friday, which is the 20th of September. From there forward, those prices will be set. I'll obviously do discounts roughly and around about or whatever. But ultimately, I think they're just an amazing first step into learning some of my ideas. If you're not ready for the mentorship, or if you're not ready for the wormhole when that rolls around, or you really just want to see what I'm about and how I educate and the ideas that I'm sharing, I think they're a fantastic entry point that's a layer deeper than simply just the content that I'm sharing on socials and here on the podcast or on YouTube, depending on when you're following. So again, please check them out. We've already had like 10 or 11 people purchase stuff, which is really cool. Most people are buying the bundle, which is what I would hope, because the bundle shows you both upper and lower. So hopefully, yeah, if you have any questions for that though, please let me know. And if you do decide to purchase it, let me know how your training is going. Like I'm keen to help with your technique or your understanding. If you have further questions, please just let me know. I'm always here to help. And that's just open to anyone. If you have questions, just send me a DM on Instagram. I'm happy to chat about these things and help you with your understanding, whether or not you've purchased something or not. Just, I'm here to help. That's like the core line of what I'm trying to do, is just help young coaches and coaches better understand these ideas and the application. So awesome. It was a huge project too. I completely undershot how big that project was. We had a filming day like a month ago and filmed like 3 hours worth of the exercise tutorials and some of the big rocks of the technique stuff for the squat, bench press, and deadlift. And then like I was building the slides out. Man, I've fucking built so many slides in the last 4 months with the 2 intakes, the Q&As, the wormhole stuff, these projects, like programs, sorry, like there's been so many fucking slides being built. I'm sick of making slides, but there's more stuff coming, so I've just got to stay on top of it. But it was a huge project. Fuck me. Way bigger than I thought. I probably undershot the time investment by about threefold. But I'm glad they're done, and I think they're really valuable, and I know that a lot of people are going to get a lot out of them. So keen to hear how you go. If you are interested, Core saves 30% until Friday. Yeah. The final thing that I wanted to chat through is that I actually had a business meeting about a month ago with the boys at The System, which is a fascinating business and a fascinating business idea. JP Maliatsis used to be our osteo at our very first gym. He rented the room initially before Dan and Evolve took over. But that business is around matched betting, which is a wild idea, but ultimately it's like it's like a mathematical sort of edge that you get against the bookies, and I think they're doing amazing things. They're incredibly inspiring, almost as inspired by them as anyone else currently, and what they're doing and their community, and they're just action taking and moving forward and developing things and ideas, and all the stuff they're doing is just really inspiring. And I've been chatting with JP a lot over the last couple of months, and it ultimately got to a point where I had a business meeting with him, and also the other boys, Tom and Steve, the three owners of it. And I went into their office in Richmond, and had a 3 hour session unpacking some of my ideas with both strength culture and training model, and sort of the next phase for both of those things, because there has been a lot of priority shifts since I've become a dad, and some of the stuff around my life has changed, and my goals for my future and work load and stress, because I have been incredibly stressed for the better part of 4 years since the start of COVID. It has just been just not only with work, but also outside of work. And I've spoken pretty detailed around all that sort of stuff. But um, ultimately, I went in and had a chat with these boys, and showed them my two sort of business models to move forward with my two businesses, and got some good feedback on them. And I'm just going to speak around some of the training model stuff initially. But obviously, I've built two foundations courses, and my goal with the foundation courses were for them to be like just sort of like entry level points to my ideas. And ultimately, core performance programs were always in line, and I wanted to build those out. But since chatting with them and building out those programs, I've identified that maybe the coaching foundation course that is currently just called training model, I'm thinking that might be remodeled and reshaped into a free resource. And I want to have the free resource completed before, maybe within like 3 weeks, before the middle of October. And what I'm thinking of is 10 very detailed, like 15 to 20 minute videos, that move through some of the key principles of the ideas that are within the foundation of my model for programming, for movement, and then also for business. There would probably only be 2 business videos. I think the other 8 would be very training, coaching centered. In fact, they will be. I want it to be 80% training and coaching, and then just a little bit of business at the end if you wanted to go through that. But I want to develop a free course, with the goal of the free course to really makes the people running through it think a little deeper about some of the stuff they're learning, and ultimately starting to shred the narratives of the shit that I think is just completely unnecessary in the understanding, and really challenging some core ideas that I think need to just be removed from the overall coaching process. Things like joint stability is something that I think it just confuses and nocebos people. So that would be an idea that I wanted to like kind of attack and break down, and what we're actually thinking about when we're thinking about joint stability. And like everyone knows what we're talking about, but the idea that things become unstable is just so it's just so backwards in how the system actually works. So like challenging that idea, challenging some programming based stuff, and like the evidence based crowd around like volume prescriptions and intensity prescriptions, and those sort of things that just fall by the wayside when you actually have a client in front of you that either doesn't like something or doesn't want to do something, or they have other context or constraints within them that doesn't allow you to move in line with the evidence-based crowd, and what the evidence strongly suggests. Things like tension, and better understanding what tension actually is, and muscle contraction. Because if you've been following my stuff, muscle contraction is part of the tension process, but a muscle doesn't contract. A muscle creates tension. That is the key thing that we need to understand. And if you've learned movement through the muscular lens first, you reconcile your information with the idea that the contraction is the most important thing, where it's not. The contraction is part of the tension response of a muscle. So going through all of those ideas that are really going to, I think if I set this thing up right, really challenge coaches to think a little bit deeper on some core ideas within coaching, both programming and movement. And I've got a little list. I'm going to refine it a little more. And ultimately, it will become a free course, a free resource that's available on the website. some of the videos will probably be available on YouTube as just public, but the goal would be to really just challenge people to think a little bit deeper around some of the ideas and narratives they've got. So that is something that's going to come out. My goal is to have that done by middle of October. I've got a little time tomorrow to plan out the 10 videos. I've got a rough idea, but I really want to push that. That's pretty much it. I've got 3 guests lined up for the podcast. I'm filming a couple this week. My goal with the guest podcast, they'll probably be like 30 to 40 minutes with each of them, and then like a little recap from me at the end is how I'm thinking about going through that. We'll see how the episodes roll. But yeah, keen for that, keen for everything really. And again, just thank you for sticking by. If you're new here, thanks for listening to this one. Please subscribe to the YouTube channel if you haven't already. If you're keen on the core performance programs, either the upper or the lower, again, code CORE, CORE, saves 30% until Friday the 20th. If you have any questions, just hit me in the DMs. Happy to chat. But we're done. Thank you very much. We'll see you next week.